Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In today's video, I'm going to be showing you how to replace the transmission mount on a 2013 Kia Forte. The process is very similar for any second generation or first generation Kia Forte, which includes the model years from 2010 to 2018. As a side note, I did mean to release this video last week but got sidetracked a little because of personal and work commitments, so I do apologize for that. The tools you'll need are a ratchet with an extension, 10, 12, 14 and 17mm sockets, a breaker bar, a swivel or a universal joint, a screwdriver with a Phillips head bit, a torque wrench, a jack, and a wooden plank with dimensions of approximately 10 by 5 inches. The only part you'll be needing is a Kia transmission mount with the part number as shown. Before we begin, a small warning. Please be aware that there is always a pinch point whenever a mount is removed and the transmission or the motor is supported by a jack. Under no circumstances should you ever insert your hand into this area. First, we'll start by removing the battery terminals. Always remove the negative terminal first, followed by the positive. Remove both the terminals and set them aside. Now we can go ahead and remove the battery from the car. Next, we will remove the airbox cover. There are 4 clamps, one in each corner as shown. Unclip the front 2 clamps on the airbox and then use a screwdriver with a Phillips bit to loosen the circular clamp holding the air intake pipe in place. Then disconnect the airbox cover from the air intake pipe and remove the 2 clamps at the back. You might have to wiggle it around a little bit, but now you can remove the airbox cover. Carefully unplug the 2 electrical connectors as shown and then remove the 2 10mm bolts holding the airbox down. One is directly in front of the airbox, whereas the other is at the right back corner. Again, space is at a premium, so you may have to wiggle it around, but now you can remove the airbox and the ECU assembly and set it aside. Now we can actually set eyes on the transmission mount and its bracket. Before we get to removing the mount and the bracket, we need to support the transmission with a jack so that it doesn't sag later on. We'll be doing this using a jack with a wooden plank on it to distribute the weight evenly. Place the wooden plank on the saddle such that the center point of the saddle corresponds to the center point of the plank. The transmission is located to the left if you look towards the front of the vehicle. The transmission can be supported using the flat area as shown. Position the jack carefully and slowly raise it so that the flat area is contacted by the wooden plank. Remember that you don't need to raise the transmission and just support it. Now we can focus our attention back to the mount. We will first remove the mount bracket, followed by the transmission mount itself. First, we'll remove these 2 bolts holding the mount to the bracket, followed by the 4 bolts holding the bracket to the transmission. All these bolts take a 17mm socket. Break the first 2 bolts open using a breaker bar, and then use either an impact gun or a ratchet to remove them as they are quite long. Break open the 4 bolts holding the bracket to the transmission using a breaker bar again, and follow the same procedure to remove the bolts and set them aside. Now you should be able to easily slide the bracket out from under the transmission mount. Keep it safe as we'll be reusing it. The transmission mount itself is held in by 4 bolts. 3 of them are pretty easy to see and can be accessed from the top. The 4th one, however, is a little obscure and is located next to the transmission below the mount. There is not a lot of room between the transmission and the mount, so we will be using the breaker bar, an extension, and a swivel joint to get to it. The best way to get the socket onto this bolt is by propping the universal joint against the transmission. Once you manage to loosen the bolt, remove it by hand and set it aside. Break the remaining 3 bolts loose and remove them as well. We can now go ahead and remove the old transmission mount. Put the new transmission mount in place and align the bolt holes as shown. Hand tighten all 4 bolts before you tighten them with the ratchet to make sure that you don't cross thread them. Since the bottom bolt requires a swivel joint, we won't be torquing it to spec as the angle throws off the torque reading. So we'll go ahead and tighten it until we can't turn it further even with a breaker bar. The torque spec for the remaining 3 bolts is 42 foot-pounds. Now that the transmission mount is in place, we can slide the bracket under the mount and align the bolt holes. Hand tighten the bolts first and then use a ratchet to get them nice and snug. The torque spec for these 4 bolts is 72 foot-pounds. Now that both the mount and its bracket are secure, if you look at it from the top, you may notice that the holes in the mount do not align with the threads in the bracket. Not to worry, as the core of the transmission mount is soft rubber and it can be easily moved so that the holes align with the threads as shown. Install the 2 bolts by hand, being careful not to cross thread. This will secure the mount to its bracket. The torque spec for these 2 bolts is 72 foot-pounds. Now that the transmission mount and its bracket are secure, we can go ahead and slowly lower the jack. Now we'll start replacing the components that we removed in order to get to the transmission mount. Put the airbox assembly back in place and reinstall the two 10mm bolts holding it down. Reinstall the airbox cover on top and secure it in place using the 4 clamps on the corners. Reconnect the plugs to the ECU and make sure that the connections are tight. Finally, put the battery back in place and reconnect the terminals, starting with the positive and then the negative. So that brings us to the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you liked the content, make sure to subscribe as I make new videos every week. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.